Hi, I'm Joan Cartan Hansen. Thank you for joining us for this Dialogue Web Extra. I'm talking with John Grossenbacher, Director of the Idaho National Laboratory. I want to ask some questions about waste. This week in a court in Washington, D.C., the state of Washington and Tri-City businessmen are going to court to try and stop the Obama administration from closing up Yucca Mountain. What can you tell us about what's the issue in that question?
Well, at its core, the issue is that Yucca Mountain and taking used fuel from reactors and disposing of it in Yucca Mountain is the law of the land. The Nuclear Waste Policy Act says that's our plan in the United States. And now what's being questioned, and it's, Congress passed a law that says that, is the authority of an administration to withdraw the license application for Yucca Mountain when the law says Yucca Mountain and there's no plan B. So
Right.
that's the issue.
And Yucca Mountain is for storage of high
High-level
level
waste.
radioactive waste.
Spent nuclear fuel and waste particularly from the weapons program in the United States. It's highly radioactive and appropriately disposed of that way.
So until there's a plan B in place, that waste stays close to the plants?
The used fuel stays
Yeah.
stays at the reactor sites.
Okay. Now there's also a Blue Ribbon Commission looking at the bigger question of what to do with nuclear waste. That report is supposed to come out this summer, you say?
I think their preliminary report will be out this summer, and then their final by the end of the year. And that's exactly right. I mean, they were chartered by the president to, if we're not going to do Yucca Mountain, then give me some recommendations on Plan B. And whatever they recommend will have to be, of course, adopted, and the law will have to be changed.
Because right now the law says it goes to Yucca Mountain.
That's right. And
Okay.
but in some ways, I think this can be a very useful refocusing on this issue in the U.S. and what we're going to do about it.
And how does this impact the INL?
Well, I think it can have very positive impacts in many ways. If I were the Blue Ribbon Commission chairman for a day, I mean, what I would like to see is all right, let's take the used fuel at reactor sites, and the government agreed to take it, so the utilities are suing the government. Let's cut a deal. Obviously, we didn't live up to our agreement. Keep it there for the life of the reactor. If it's orphan fuel, that is, the reactor is not operating anymore, and there's about 70,000 tons of used fuel in the U.S., and about 3,000 is orphaned. That should go somewhere. It shouldn't sit at a site where the only reason you have guards and fences is because you've got used fuel there. So that needs to be taken care of. If you're building a new reactor, hey, plan on the reactor life plus 70 years of storing it. It's not a huge cost impact, but just plan on it.
Yeah.
Now, INL, other laboratories, our brain trust in the U.S., let's do some serious research and development to see if we have choices that are different or better than the ones we have today, which is right now basically the once-through fuel cycle, where you take used fuel and you dispose of it in an underground repository. Or, the other choice today is reprocessing, as it's practiced in France and Japan. Can we do better than that? And let's see if there's other choices, because in my opinion, there's a lot of energy left in that used fuel.
Mm-hmm.
And I think fission energy, nuclear energy, it's 1,000-year plus energy source. I think mankind is going to need and want and to use that energy. So let's everybody slow down, take a deep breath, and figure out what our choices are with a much longer term perspective.
It's hard for the brain trust to operate, though, under the current congressional budget where they're cutting funding to the Energy Department.
Mm-hmm.
How big of an issue is that going to be?
Well, it's not a crisis for us yet, and the deliberations continue, and we'll have to see.
Yeah. Well, we at Public Television can understand that. We did have a Facebook question about WIPP. Now, WIPP, the WIPP plant is low-level radiation. Is that first explain what the WIPP site is.
Waste Isolation Pilot Plant
Right,
is
yeah.
a facility in New Mexico, near
Right.
Carlsbad, New Mexico, that receives primarily transuranic waste, which is code word for basically plutonium-contaminated materials. A lot of materials from the weapons program. A lot of the materials that were brought here from the weapons facility in Rocky Flats in Colorado was disposed of here at the INL site, is being unearthed, characterized, and shipped to WIPP.
Right.
And the majority of that is plutonium-contaminated stuff.
Fritz asked if there are still routine shipments of contaminated waste being sent to WIPP from the INL, and do you know of any plans to take any other kinds of waste, more like radioactive waste, at WIPP?
the answer to the first question is yes, we're shipping that material out all the time, and actually the end point is in sight. I mean, we can see when the cleanup contractors will complete that work. And there's talk of using that repository for other things. It's very different from Yucca Mountain. It's a salt repository, whereas Yucca Mountain is I'll just describe it as a hard rock repository. And so there are different characteristics and in terms of the behavior of the repository when you when you decide to stick stuff in it. So what's going to happen? What's the salt going to do to this particular kind of material? So they're very different, but there is talk of that.
What do you think is the biggest challenge facing commercial nuclear power industry today?
Ooh, well, I think first and foremost, before Japan, before the issue in Japan, I'd say the number one issue is financial and policies in the U.S. If natural gas is cheap and plentiful, and there's no penalty for the carbon associated with it, which is generally about half as much as you'd put in the atmosphere if you were burning coal, and the capital costs of building a natural gas plant are much less than nuclear. You're going to build natural gas. Now, is that what we want to do? Natural gas, there's a lot of it in the U.S. There's going to be some issues about how hard it is to extract it. There's going to be some appropriate environmental attention to how the methods we use. But in the end, it's a finite resource. Natural gas is good for a lot of things. It's good for heating homes. It's good for transportation, for vehicles, for light vehicles, so for example. So is that the best use of that natural gas? But that's what, in my opinion, utilities are incentivized to do. And nuclear, long term, may not see a profit for 17 years. I'm the capitalization of my company as a utility is small compared to the $6 to $8 billion investment for this plant. Why would I do that? Why would I take that risk? Or can I sell my board of directors on the risk? I think that was issue number one for the industry in the U.S. Now, post-Japan, I think the issue will be how do people in the United States react to it, and what do they understand about it, and then how do they interpret that and convert that into their judgment about our energy choices? I think that's critically important, and it's a service. It's a good service that this incident in Japan can provide, because romanticizing and demonizing technologies just leads to bad choices. And we've got to evaluate our energy choices in terms of cost, risk, environmental impact over appropriate time frames, and we've got to be realistic about practical energy solutions. I mean, we can come up with lots of elaborate schemes and approaches that make energy so expensive that we can inhibit or jeopardize the economic performance of the country. I mean, these are real issues, and we have to look outside the United States at the rest of the world and the enormous energy demand that's out there. We have an important leadership role. What are we going to do? What are we going to do with 300 million Indians that live in abject poverty? It's not good for them to stay in that condition. It's not, I would even argue from my personal standpoint, that's not moral. So what are we going to do about it? Let's have some practical, realistic solutions. And I think when you do that and you look at them all objectively, I think nuclear energy will compete very, very well. But the test for us in the United States is, are we going to do that? Or are we going to romanticize, demonize? I think that's critically important.
So how does the nuclear industry essentially sell itself? I mean, that's maybe the biggest issue. They've not done a great job selling it.
Well, I think
people aren't willing to hear it.
One difference, a good contrast, is in France. In France, of course, it's different. In France, nuclear energy and a commitment to nuclear energy is a national commitment. One of the things I did there once is I looked at where their facilities were, and I said, well, why did you put this facility here? Wouldn't it have been smarter to put it closer? And they said, no, you don't understand. We want every province to share in the benefits and the burdens associated with this infrastructure in our country, so we spread it around, and that was conscious. We don't have that kind of, or certainly haven't had, a consistent national commitment to the use of nuclear energy, and I think that's important for the reasons I talked about earlier. 100 years, big capital investment. This is for the long term. This isn't short-term market forces. If we allow our energy choices to be driven solely by short-term market forces, I think we're going to be sorry. So I think in part what the nuclear industry has to do is articulate that problem and that challenge in terms of the nature of their business publicly and with governmental officials, but it needs a base of people, electorate, us, who are thinking critically and consciously about our energy choices and don't succumb to the short attention span. Let's I don't like that one because that's not cool. Or romanticize it. It's always easy to romanticize renewables and demonize coal and nuclear. Well, they all have cost, risks, and environmental impacts, and there's no free lunch. Now, what do you want to do? How are you going to power your country, and how are we going to power the world? Let's get serious about it. So I think they can stimulate, they can and should participate in that debate and stimulate it, but in the end, I think the American people have to decide that we're serious about our energy future.
And we've run out of time, sir. Thank you very much. I appreciate you joining us.
Well, thank you, Joan.
And thank you for joining us for this Dialogue Web Extra.